Hello, good morning. We're just going to give it a minute or so before we get going, just to allow some more people to filter in if they need to, and then we'll crack on. Bear with me just a moment. So, good morning, everyone. So as an introduction to myself, and I think some people are still trickling in, but as an introduction, my name is Martin Simon, and I'm one of the Microsoft commercial execs here at Bytes. So an overlay to some of the account team, so we'll be looking at Microsoft licensing and the commercials around that. So here today to talk through some licensing in regards to hybrid infrastructure and how we would look at that in public cloud as well as on-premise internally. We are going to have a Q&A at the end if there are any questions, but there is also a chat box to add in those if you think of any midway through, and then we'll go through some of those at the end if there are any. So what we're going to look at today on the agenda is look at how we license Windows Server, how we license System Center Server, which is very similar, and then core infrastructure server suite, so an explanation on that and procurement in regards to that. Then we'll have a high level overview of SQL licensing and the different versions and license models that are able in there. And then some of the software assurance benefits, mainly looking at license mobility that allows you to move to public cloud and other some nuances when we're looking at public cloud moving forward. So to start, Windows Server licensing. So Windows Server comes in a couple of options, so Windows Server Standard and Windows Server Data Center. When we're looking at it from a user or device point of view, every user or device within the business that is accessing a Windows Server, whether that directly or indirectly, requires a client access license. So any user that effectively authenticating against Active Directory that's on premise, for example, a client access license would be required. When we're looking at licensing the server itself, so we always look at the license, the physical cores on a box, and there are minimums per processor, so 8 cores per processor, but also 16 per physical host as well, so per physical server. We're going to go a bit deeper into that in just a second. So when we are looking at a server, again, like I mentioned, it's core-based licensing. So if we look at this first server, for example, it has one processor with 8 cores. As the minimum is 16 cores per host, we need to license that with 16 cores. The cores can come in different packs. It can come in a 16-core pack or a 2-core pack. So we just need to get to that maximum number of 16 cores. If we look at a second example of this as well, so we have 2 processors. Each processor has 12 cores, so over the minimum for each processor, and in total over the minimum per server. So for this instance, we've got here, we're looking at 24 cores in total. It depends on how you want to license that in packs. And as a third example, we're looking at a 4 processor host with 4 cores per processor. As we need to do 8 cores per processor, we need to basically add the 32 cores in total. So hopefully that makes some sense, but that's how we get to the calculation of covering all cores for Windows Server licensing. On the left-hand side, we're looking at user cows and where user cows would be, I guess, more cost-effective from a commercial point of view. So if a user has, in that top scenario, 3 devices that all link to your on-premise server, it is going to be more cost-effective to license that user with a cow rather than every single device that user has. Similarly to the bottom left in this scenario as well. If we shift over to the right-hand side, this is where device cows become more commercially viable, when you might have a shared device where multiple users access that device at any one time, or over maybe a shift period. So, for example, maybe a call center as an example to that. All Windows Server licensing is core-based, and cows are always required, and we will always reiterate that just from a compliance point of view. But always just keep note of the minimum of 8 cores per physical processor and 16 cores per server. So client access licenses are used for internal users, but what do we do for have a website, for example, that's hosted on your servers that goes out to external users, and how do we license that? So on the screen, you'll see a blue ticket, for example, that has EC. We call that an external connector. So there is an external connector license that you can add to either the physical host or to a virtual machine that may move around host to host. So there are different ways in which you can cover that potential either virtual machine or physical host in regards to that. So highlighted is the one that has a virtual machine of that it is externally facing. So we would license that physical host with an external connector, because that's the only one that has access from an external user. We need to make sure that, again, even if it's from an indirect point of view, that this is always covered from a compliance standpoint. If we have an external connector and we have software assurance on it, and it's just a virtual machine that is externally facing, we can add, or we can cover that virtual machine with SA. It will then allow that external connector to move from host to host within that cluster. So sometimes can be the most cost-effective way to cover either a virtual machine or a host. In this scenario, if you had multiple virtual machines that were externally facing, what you could also do is cover all of those 3 hosts with an external connector to allow those external users access to a Windows Server instance. So virtual machine mobility. So when you have a physical host and you have multiple virtual machines set on there, depending on the amount of virtual machines is actually dependent on the edition that we would cover it with. So for instance, in this scenario, there is plenty of virtual machines. So in short, if it's over about 10, data center is more cost effective. So we would license this instance with a Windows Server data center license to allow unlimited virtual machines to sit on that host. If we had a second host within the cluster, and those virtual machines can move from host to host at any time, we would need to license that second host with data center also. And again, if we have a third one within the cluster, we would again cover it with data center, and this will allow virtual machines to move from host to host whenever required, and unlimited instances on any one of those 3 hosts. So something to always kind of take note, especially when we're looking at clusters. Again, all all hosts in that cluster are allowed unlimited virtualization when covered with data center licensing. So if we look at standard licensing, so Windows Server Standard, when you license all physical cores with that minimum of 16 cores per host, you are entitled to run up to 2 virtual machines on that host. So there are some scenarios where you would have a host and you might have 4 virtual machines, or in this scenario again on screen, 6 virtual machines. Windows Server Standard allows for what is called stacking. So you would cover all physical cores, at least meeting the minimum requirement of 16 on that server. That will allow 2 virtual machines. If we want another 2, we would just license all physical cores again meeting that minimum requirement. So in this top line, we would need 32 cores to cover up to 4 virtual machines on that physical host. And then when we get to 6, again, we add another 16 cores that then allows another 2 virtual machines to sit on there. Depending on the amount of physical cores on that host is obviously dependent on how many cores we need to keep adding on top to stack another 2 virtual machines moving forward. So let's look at licensing System Center Server. So System Center Server, again, is a core and cal model, so very similar to Windows Server, but we always need to license. If we are managing the client endpoints, we need to be able to make sure that they are all covered from a management license point of view. So if we're looking at the right-hand side for all of these PCs, laptops, tablets, etc., we need to make sure that each of these end user devices has a client management license attached to them. Very similar to the Windows Server CAL to have access, but if we're managing these endpoints, we need a management license. Management licenses, or client management licenses, can be procured either on their own as perpetual licenses or subscriptions, but they are also included in quite a lot of online services. And again, we'll get to that in a moment to show you where they are already included. If we want to manage the servers, we need to license each of those servers to utilize the services within System Center. So again, we need to cover them. Same rules apply as Windows Server, 8 cores per processor and 16 cores per server. You may get a bit sick of me saying that by the end of this call. But again, as an example, if we have 2 processors at 12 cores, we need to cover them with 24 cores of System Center Server. I won't go through the others here, but again, you can see that we need to make sure we're covering those physical servers every single time to manage them. One thing to also note is the management server itself, so that the actual console to manage System Center components, whether it be the client endpoint or the servers that you are managing, that is a free install. So the console itself could be sat on another server that isn't managed with System Center, but you are able to install that free of charge to be able to manage all of your System Center environment. So to look at the additions, again, very similar to Windows Server. So we've got Standard and Data Center. Same rules apply when we're looking at the virtual machines or OSEs of 2 and then unlimited. But you can also see that within System Center Server, there are many components that you could utilize. If you're just using one of these on a server, System Center Server is required. Obviously, just bear in mind, if you are using one, it may be worth looking at others to move forward and utilize, basically get the most out of your System Center Server licensing you have today. So, as I mentioned in regards to the management licenses themselves, the left-hand side obviously shows a multitude of different either online subscriptions or on-premise CALs. You can see where some of these management licenses are actually already included. So things like Endpoint Manager, again, if you have EMS or Microsoft 365 E3, you already have the license to be able to utilize those services of System Center to manage those client endpoints themselves. Anything else, things like SCOM and DPM and Orchestrator, they would be additional licenses that would need to be added if you, again, managing the endpoint side of things. So, brief look at core infrastructure. So core infrastructure service suite is, in short, Windows Server and System Center in one as a package. And to buy it in a package, it's cheaper than buying both of them separately. So there are different ways to procure it. It can be procured under pretty much any program. But if you have enough cores in total and cover your whole estate, there is options to potentially look at a specific program, which is called a server cloud enrollment, or on here a SKI, which reduces that cost even more so. So there's actually additional discounts when committing core infrastructure service suite across the estate. It needs to include every single install, and you can't use previous perpetual licenses that you may have already owned. So a look at SQL Server. So when we're looking at the additions of SQL Server and where we need to actually license SQL Server itself, it comes, obviously, as you can see on the screen, 4 different options. Express is free. There is also SQL Developer, which is also free to download. So you can go in and download that. I think you need a Visual Studio Community subscription, which is free to sign up. You are then able to actually download SQL Developer, install it, and use it for test and development purposes only. You can't run production data or serve clients with production data, so something to be aware of. But there is a free install of that for the use of test and development. So the ones we do need to license, so Enterprise and Standard, there are different license options for each. Enterprise only comes as per core now, unless you have carried on software assurance from the previously legacy editions of how we license SQL, which is Server Cal. I will go through Server Cal because for standard, Server Cal is still an option today. So if we are looking at Server Cal, so we need to cover if a virtual machine or physical host has SQL installed, we need to cover that physical host or that virtual machine with a server license. So we cover that server, and then any user or device accessing that server, whether that be direct or indirect access, requires a client access license to access that server or that edition of SQL Server. When we're looking at indirect access, and this does come up quite a lot, if a user or device is accessing an application that the back-end database is SQL, they are indirectly accessing SQL, and therefore a client access license is required. So if we have a scenario with that Mr. John has his device, and his device accesses an application that sits on a server, the back end of that accesses a SQL database, then the device or the user requires a client access license within that, even though they are not directly accessing SQL. If we're looking at Server Cal on a virtual machine level, again, we just cover that virtual machine if that has SQL installed. Each virtual machine that has SQL installed of SQL Standard would require a server license. And then on top of that, as mentioned, any user or device requires only one CAL to access multiple servers or virtual machines with SQL Server installed on that. I will go into a bit more detail into licensability in a moment as well. But if you buy with, if you're covering a virtual machine, it's moving host to host, software assurance is required. And if you want to actually move that VM later on into a third-party cloud, SA is also required on the CAL, but again, we will go into a bit more detail and show you that shortly. So the other way of licensing SQL Server Standard And the only way to buy new SQL Server Enterprise and to license it today is per core. So every virtual machine or every processor requires a minimum of 4 cores per processor or per virtual machine to be licensed in a correct way. So if we're looking again at the scenarios here, we have a virtual machine or a physical host with 1 core, we need to cover the license requirement would be 4 cores, whether that is enterprise or whether that is standard. And as we go from left to right, no matter the number of cores that are on that processor or virtual machine, we need to make sure that they are covered correctly from a compliance standpoint. Again, as mentioned, so working the same with a virtual machine, you could have a virtual machine that you assign 1 vCore, 1 vCPU to that virtual machine, but 4 core licenses is required from a compliance standpoint when we're looking at SQL. Again, no matter if it's enterprise or standard. So a couple of scenarios on the right. A lot of these slides will be sent out after, but again, just for your information. So software assurance benefits and the benefits of both Windows Server, System Center, and SQL that we're talking through today. I won't go through all of them, but in any kind of detail. But new version rights is pretty self-explanatory, really. So you will carry on getting the new version rights as they are deployed if you have active software assurance. Step-up rights come in mainly, I'd probably say, with SQL that we see, but also available with System Center and Windows. If you have SQL Server Standard today and have active software assurance, you are entitled to step up that license to a higher edition if you need to or want to moving forward. License mobility, we're going to go into a bit more detail of that, so I won't go in any more detail right now. Hybrid use benefit. This is where if you have software assurance on-premise and you want to move to Microsoft's Azure, you have the ability to use your licenses that you have already paid for and have a reduced cost in the Azure platform, whether that is platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. And there are more details on that in one of the sessions later on. I think it starts about 3 o'clock, which will talk way more into hybrid benefit and reserved instances in Azure. The other one is things like failover and DR. So SQL, if you cover an active virtual machine of SQL and it has active software assurance, you are entitled to run another virtual machine in a passive instance for that active free of charge. So you don't pay twice for the licenses, you pay once for that one active virtual machine. You have passive instances that are going further on from there. I have a couple of examples of this, either on-premise or actually in cloud, and how that works as well. So if we look at license mobility, license mobility is, in effect, if you have a cluster of machines, let's say, for example, that one of the first things we did on Windows Server, we have 3 physical hosts, and we want a virtual machine to move from host to host. We need software assurance to do that. That also allows you to move to a third-party cloud if you wanted to, not just on premises. So if we look at these 2 SQL servers today, and they're set on that host, and neither has software assurance, it can only sit on that host. If we wanted those VMs to move from host to host, we would need to license each of the physical hosts to allow 2 virtual machines. And this is if we have no software assurance. To allow for that to happen, that is how we would need to license it. So from a cost perspective point of view, a lot more expensive to do so if that's how we want those VMs to sit. If we add software assurance to those SQL VMs, those VMs can move from host to host as and when they please, really, to allow you to basically get the most out of each physical host and SQL box. So other ways with this, and when we're mentioning about third parties, if we have software assurance on these VMs again, we can move across all of our physical hosts in our cluster. And what we could also do is actually take it to a third-party data center that may host your virtual machines for you, or some public clouds. There are specific rules around public clouds, but SA will allow you to take it to a service provider's data center. It will allow you to move it to Microsoft Azure as infrastructure as a service, and also the hybrid benefit piece also. And then it can also go on dedicated hardware in other third parties, so Alibaba, AWS, Google Cloud, etc. So it must be on dedicated hosts if it's going to those, unless it's Microsoft Azure. I'm not going to go through the whole of this, but depending on the product that you have, it allows a different amount of OSEs that can be managed when you move to third-party clouds. So as an example to that, if you have System Center Data Center on-premise, but you want to move that to a third party, for every 16 cores you have with SA, it entitles you to 10 OSEs, so 10 virtual machines can be managed in that third-party data center. There's something to be aware of. If you have the whole rack in a third-party data center, it's very different. We look at the bottom physical core licensing, but if it's a shared host, then we can only manage up to 10 OSEs for the data center licenses. So something always just to make note of if moving to third party. So to be compliant when we're using license mobility, but mainly license mobility when we're taking it to another third party's data center, there is a form that needs to be filled in that just basically kept just to show that that is where you are using your hybrid benefit, your license mobility. So I mentioned earlier in regards to failover. So when we're looking at SQL failover and how we're licensing it, on the left-hand side, so server 1, we'll call that our active SQL virtual machine, and then from that, in this scenario, it has 12 cores. So we're covering all 12 cores. That also entitles us to run a passive instance, so passive secondary, and not pay for those licenses if we have software assurance. It also allows us to create a DR of that passive, and again, doesn't cost us any license. We are only paying for the active node in this scenario that we have here. If we're moving to cloud, or in this scenario, Azure, again, we only need to license the active, the primary SQL Server, and it allows us to have a passive DR in Azure at no extra cost to you, as long as you have active software assurance. Another benefit of having software assurance, but this only applies to SQL Server Enterprise per core, is you have the ability to install and run Power BI Report Server on-premise, and then allow users to then have a look at all those lovely analytics that you can create on there. So if you do have SQL Server Enterprise Edition per core with software assurance and want to look at things like Power BI reports, you are entitled to do so and install a Power BI Report Server on-premise. Just bear in mind that anyone creating those reports and then publishing those reports does require a Power BI Pro subscription, so an online service, to be able to do so. But the server itself, you have the rights to install. So some outsourcer rules. So when we're looking at outsourcer rules, there was a change in October 2019 that basically, in short, in AWS you have the ability to have a dedicated host. So prior to October 2019, if you just had a license with no software assurance, you were able to move it to a dedicated host in a listed provider. That all changed in October 2019. You now have to have software assurance, even if it's a dedicated host in one of those cloud providers, whether that be Google, Alibaba, or AWS, and also in some multi-tenant cloud services. So if you are doing that now and have third parties, software assurance is pretty much a must most of the time. But always happy to have a conversation with anyone in regards to that if they have any concerns, if they are in a third party today. A couple of things to shout out when we're looking at third parties or listed providers, for example. So a listed provider is AWS, Alibaba, Microsoft, and Google Cloud. If you have Microsoft Apps for Enterprise, either standalone or in any one of your online services, you can install and access Microsoft Apps for Enterprise, but only in Microsoft Azure or in a qualified multi-tenant hosted partner. Just bear in mind that AWS, Alibaba, and Google Cloud are not a qualified multi-tenant hosted partner. So you would have to rent Office if you had a Windows virtual machine, a Windows 10 virtual machine with Office installed. You need to rent that from that provider themselves. The rights to Apps for Enterprise doesn't allow to move to a listed provider, only a QMTH partner. So just bear that in mind as well. Again, other pieces with that, alongside those qualified multi-tenant partners, Windows 10 can be used in either Azure or, again, a multi-tenant hosted partner. So if you are using that in AWS, Alibaba, or Google, you need to actually have, and the only subscription that will allow you to access a Windows 10 or 11 virtual machine is a Windows VDA E3 per user. So it's only per user, per device doesn't allow it, but per user does. So again, if you have any Windows desktops in those environments and you aren't renting it from AWS, just make sure that you do have VDA subscriptions on that. And that is it. Are there any questions? I've seen one has popped up. So we have a question. So are there any time constraints reference moving licenses? E.g., can we only move every 90 days? So yes. So if we go back to the, for example, so in the scenario that we've got here, and take away the title of licensability because we're kind of not talking about that with this regard. If you have 3 hosts and you have a virtual machine covered with SQL with no software assurance, you are able to move it to another host, but it can't move back within 90 days. So you would be stuck for 90 days. So it takes away any of the actual mobility, really. And it would have to be very strict to say it just can't move back. And that's a compliance rule. It's called license reassignment. Yeah. Hopefully that answers the question. Any more? If there are any, you can keep typing. And again, just to reiterate, there are some more sessions later on. We've got modern workplace, some security, and then optimizing costs. So optimizing costs has come, again, I kind of mentioned that earlier in regards to hybrid benefits and reserved instances. So that may be worth looking at if you are wanting to reduce the cost of some of that cloud spend, especially when you have software assurance on premises today for those licenses. If that is it, I guess if you do have any questions that are specific to you as a business, please obviously get in touch with either your account manager or you can email tellmemore@bytes.co.uk and someone will be in touch and then we can have a conversation either with me or someone else in our team as well, so we can be in touch for specific questions. So we have had another question. So are RDS cows required with Windows 10 VDI in Azure? No, it would be required to, it does, well, yes and no, it depends on the Windows 10 image that you have in Azure. If you're using Azure Virtual Desktop, then and you have Windows 10 licenses and it's a Windows 10 image, no, RDS cows aren't required. If you were using it as Windows Server OS image for that desktop, then RDS cows are required. So it does depend on actually what you are doing. But if it's Windows 10, no, if you're using Azure Virtual Desktop. Any more for any more? But again, like I said, yeah, get in touch with your account manager if you have any specific questions. Happy to jump on a call to go through specific scenarios that each customer or environment may have. But yeah, always there. But we will leave it there and enjoy your day. Thank you very much for listening.